Hi folks, welcome to the Liberty Vigil, day 14, Talk Hidden Values here, and we are starting to wind down to the end of our vigil. 2 more days after tonight until Independence Day. We will be celebrating that heartily this year. Today we're going to talk about civil disobedience and considering the question whether or not Thoreau was a wuss. Because Thoreau spent a night in jail for refusing to pay his taxes. He refused to pay his taxes as a matter of integrity because he didn't want to support the effort of the United States in the Mexican War, but he didn't refuse to go to jail. He embraced the idea of paying the consequences of his disobedience, which in most definitions of civil disobedience is part of the construct that we are willing to take that consequence as part of resisting the existing governmental system that's in place. We're willing to accept the consequences it imposes on us for resisting violating the law that we feel is unjust. And I'm wondering how that might be different if we find ourselves in a system which has in and of itself become profoundly unjust. So it just makes me wonder if we were in the situation that Thoreau was in, or he were in ours, if we might have done things differently, or he might do things differently. So that's the consideration today. And to start with, I want to straighten out a couple of misconceptions. The first one being around civil disobedience. The original title of the essay that Thoreau wrote the day after his night in jail was actually called The Resistance to Civil Government. So civil really describes the government that we are resisting, not the kind of disobedience we're engaging in. Civil disobedience can take all kinds of forms. I'm not recommending that we be not civil. I'm just suggesting that that's not really, civil is not a descriptor for our behavior as much as it is for the government. And secondly, I want to look at a distinction with the Eastern tradition of the same era. Both Gandhi and Thoreau fall in that time frame from the mid-19th century into the early 20th century. Gandhi is a well-known, kind of a familiar person, at least as much as Thoreau, if not more so, although maybe not as thoroughly understood here in the West. I think we tend to have more of a superficial understanding of him. And he's associated largely with the principles of nonviolence. Ahimsa is the Sanskrit word. And it's a really profound, thoroughgoing spiritual concept, but over time he developed out of it a doctrine for political action called satyagraha, which is a Sanskrit expression made up of 2 concepts. Satya meaning truth and agraha meaning insistence, which he talked about as the force of truth force, meaning the power of the truth to accomplish political purposes. I remember when the film Gandhi came out, some of you might have seen it. I was in junior high and I went to see it with my family in the theater. It's long, but it's an excellent film. And at one point in the film, he's addressing a crowd of people who are trying to understand his approach and are looking to him for inspiration as to how to stand up to the colonial British powers. And they're feeling oppressed, and they've been brutalized in some of their previous attempts to resist. And he's encouraging them to move forward with this principle, actually, of ahimsa, of complete nonviolence, even in the face of brutal force. And he says to them, if they kill me, then they will have my dead body, not my obedience, which was a really impactful idea for me when I was, 12 or 13. And it still is a really impactful idea. And I'm not making the suggestion that that's how everyone should approach a situation of resistance by any means, but it is one way to approach resistance with that posture of total nonviolence. It's one that's been embraced in Eastern religions and one that's been embraced in Christianity, both Eastern Christianity and in Western Christianity, by the martyrs. Martyr actually just means witness in Greek, so we aren't always called upon to sacrifice our lives in our witnessing for Christ, but sometimes we are. And when that occurs, our willingness to do that is one of the ways that we demonstrate our commitment to the gospel. So it certainly can be an honorable way of resisting worldly powers and corruption. I also think that there are any number of other measures we can take that involve defending ourselves that are also honorable pathways, and can be consistent with godly pathways for Christian people and other people of faith. And different faith practices and traditions have different understandings of that that we come to. So Thoreau wrote this essay after his night in jail, and there's also been a play written called The Night Thoreau Spent in Jail. I read it when I was back in high school, and I hadn't thought about it for a while. Certainly haven't read it since then, and went back online and looked at some of the notes on it, kind of the cheater notes for kids that don't actually want to read it. And in high school, I was a nerd, so I read everything. And but I hadn't thought about it for a while, so I'm not going to recreate it all here. It's a really kind of a convoluted play and hard to follow a little bit, which I also remembered when I went back and looked at the online notes. But there are a few themes that emerge from it, and they intertwine. One of them is the theme of contemplation and action in balance. One is the theme of silence and sound or speech in balance, and one is the theme of going along or standing up, and the balance between those things. And there's tension in each of those pairs, and finding that sweet spot in the middle of that struggle is definitely something that emerges in all three of those pairs in this play. So in thinking about that some more in this, in the context of our current situation, I thought again about the couple in St. Louis and how any of us could be in a situation like theirs, right? We're in our own home, our own space, in our car, on our own property with our family, and someone invades that space with that sense of that they have the entitlement, they have the right to be there, to be in our space. The difference between a home invasion, which is from someone who knows they're not entitled to be there, but they're going to take it anyway, and then this anarchical mob movement that's declaring that they actually have a right to be there. They have a right to our property, our space, to our belief, that they are entitled to demand our compliance with them. So now that we're in this position, what happens if we're in that couple's place? Do we go along? Do we stand up? Do we keep silent? Do we speak up? Are we still in a mode of contemplating what to do, or are we ready to take action? And I think each of us needs to wrestle with that ourselves. That couple stood up. Nobody else in the neighborhood was around, at least in the video I saw. It's not like, the private gated community militia all came to the door with their guns. It was just these two people on their lawn. So they stood up alone. And now that they've done that, the anarchists swept through and they stood up. And who comes behind the anarchists? The statists, right? That's why I call this an anarcho-statist movement, because that's the next phase. And so what happens is they've stood up to the anarchists, and then what has happened? They've been threatened with prosecution. In a state where they should have stand your ground and castle laws that back them up, they now have the state threatening to pursue punishing them for something that they should have felt covered and defended for. So now they're going to be asked to stand up again, or not to make that decision once again. Only now they're having to stand up not just to anarchists, but to statists. And anarchists are kind of full of sound and fury, and particularly these anarchists who were clearly acting as bullies, right? They didn't actually rush the yard when they saw the guns. So once these folks stood up to them, they kind of melted away. They didn't present a significant threat in the moment. But statists aren't like that because they have the power of the government behind them. They have structures behind them. And they have the weight of institutions behind them. And at least the appearance of legality and authority behind them. And if they can maintain that kind of appearance, then they have a lot more power to be threatening. It's a lot harder to stand up to them. So I wonder what it will be like for this couple as they're deciding whether to go along or whether to stand up. And I wonder how many of us and how many people in their own state and how many people in the media and how many people in the legal profession will be willing and ready to stand around them and help them, speak up for them, and back them up if they decide to stand up again against the statists, who can be so much more threatening than the bully anarchist mob. And I think that all of us, in various ways, are going to be in their position at some point as this situation begins to unfold. And I think one of the things that's really important for us to keep in mind is something that I have noticed in looking into this and really kind of thinking about some of the online information and some of the research about civil disobedience. 3 of the qualifiers that I came across was really well categorized, which was that we have nonviolent or violent civil disobedience, we have non-revolutionary or revolutionary civil disobedience, and we have solitary or collective civil disobedience. And I have to say, I think it's more complex than that. However, it's a really good outline. As I was looking at this outline, I thought, this really describes where we find ourselves right now. Because if we look at this anarcho-statist movement, we see that their version of, they think of themselves sort of as, they even describe themselves as the resistance, right? That they're coming up against what they label as systemic racism and this sort of conspiracy that they've identified that they're going to take on. And they do that in a violent way in the streets. They do that in a revolutionary way. They're looking to overthrow the system of government, and they're doing that inside our government. They're doing it by means of looking for different approaches to our electoral system, both in terms of wanting to get around the Electoral College, wanting to get around in-person voting for mail-in voting, wanting to make Washington, D.C. a state. They have all kinds of little systems for wanting to do this, wanting to push certain legislation and hold up other legislation. So there are all kinds of revolutionary attempts that they're making at the governmental level. And they're also doing this by collectivizing or bringing everybody under one umbrella to do one thing and say one thing in unison. So they're collectivizing at the level of business and commerce. Silence is violence. Everybody has to say the same thing. Everybody has to take a knee. Everybody has to recite a chant. Everybody has to make a statement on their website. Everybody has to, now we've gotten to the level where a group of financial investors has gone to FedEx and said, hey, we think that you, FedEx, need to go to the Washington Redskins and pressure them to change their logo because it's racist. So now it's not just a 2-party issue. Now it's a 3-party issue. We have 3 different layers of pressure and coercion that are going on in order to collectivize our attitudes, all in service of this anarcho-statist agenda. So if we are going to, as the constitutional republic, actually come together as the remnant of people that are still affirming of that reality, we are going to have to take a really strong, specific, and yet still a restrained approach to combating this. I say restrained because if we dive into violence and into revolutionary activity and into collectivism, number one, we will not beat them because that is their game. It is not our game. And they are better at it. They have a lot of experience at it. Number two, we will lose our integrity and we'll find ourselves in a place we didn't want to end up in the first place. All of those things are the enemies of liberty: violence, open revolution, and collectivism. Those are not places that we want to go. That's why we're not part of their movement to begin with. So we need to turn down the temperature on the violence, both in action and in rhetoric. We need to be very specific about the things that we want to see change in the laws and the statutes and our practices, not just attempt to cling to our existing system to keep them from overthrowing it. We don't necessarily want to keep the system exactly like it is. We don't want to become reactionaries just to fight the revolutionaries. We want to actually look at what parts of our system we're conserving and why, and where we can make changes that are wise without subverting our Constitution. And we also need to recognize that while we are going to form community to get things done as we work together, we are still going to operate as individuals who have autonomy and will make decisions that are good for ourselves and our families. And we will not be obligating one another to act in any sort of collectivist mindset. We're still going to respect each other's autonomy and individuality. So I think we really need to adopt that attitude as we go forward into our response. I was really, really glad to hear Ben Shapiro today talk about the fact that this is now the dominant culture. We are not the dominant culture of the constitutional-minded folks, left and right. It used to be that both Democrats and Republicans were constitutionally minded, and they had different interpretations of the Constitution. That hasn't been true for quite some time, since the far leftist wing of the Democrat Party has held their own party hostage, and their own party has caved to the far left. And since most of the Republican Party has been caving and going along with that that incremental bullying, we really have lost the majority of both parties. And so what's left is a remnant of a few elected officials and a lot of the American public that really wants to defend a constitutional outlook in our country. And we're going to have to do that fiercely, but still cautiously and with intelligence and restraint and integrity. I was very glad, like I started to say, to hear Ben Shapiro discuss the fact that this radicalism is now the default in the culture, and we are going to be the resistance, and we need to understand that. We can't expect that a culture to default to our perspective anymore. Essentially, if you think in a football game or a basketball game or whatever, it's like playing from behind. We're playing from behind, and you have to have a completely different game plan when you're playing from behind. So knowing that, let's go in with that approach to our preparations for Independence Day. We are going to have to regain our independence because it has been lost, both incrementally and lately under a few big tidal waves of violence and crisis. So we need to regain it as quickly as possible before it's lost to us for good. As always, like, subscribe, share, and get a little relaxation in as we go into our weekend. And I will see you again tomorrow. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate and enjoy all your comments, and can't keep them coming. And I will talk to you again tomorrow. Thank you very much. Have a good night.